There we go. John turned it off. So we're going to talk about a study that OFE put together earlier this year with our partners at Fraunhofer ISI, based in Germany, and the European University Institute, based in Florence. So we're going to be looking at the case for an EU sovereign tech fund. So just by show of hand, who here has heard of the German sovereign tech fund? Okay, roughly half or more of the people in the room? Okay, so what we're trying to do is make a case to EU policymakers that they should invest in open source funding at the European level. This isn't about the unique benefits of public funding, rather it's about diversifying the public funding landscape and looking at that bucket that John mentioned around governments getting involved in open source. So specifically what we wanted to do was to be evolutionary, not revolutionary, so really build on the well-established precedent of the German Sovereign Tech Fund and take what they've done and scale that up to the EU level. So with some generous support from GitHub and the Digital Infrastructure Insights Fund, shout out to Felix, who's here in the audience and helped usher this study into reality, we set about looking at what the case for that funding at the EU level would actually look like, and then very specifically, not just the case for how we would get there and why we would get there, but what we'll do to implement that fund and what the options are that are available to policymakers as part of ongoing political processes. So I'm going to talk a little bit more around kind of the why, and then Jen here, who is representing the work she did with the European University Institute for the last 6 months, will talk a little bit more around kind of the how and some of the legal options that are available to policymakers as we consider making such a fund a reality. So for those that have not read our study, please take the time to scan our QR code there, and that'll take you to to EU-STF.openforumeurope.org, and there you'll find our full 100-page report funding Europe's open digital infrastructure. If you go to the mini site, you'll also find a shorter policy primer and a public letter that we published just a few weeks ago, trying to make some of the findings from this longer report more accessible to policymakers and decision makers considering actually implementing the fund. So here are some of the many authors that contributed to this study, 4 of which are in the room today. So that's myself over there on the left, and Jen, who will talk to you all in just a moment. And then we also had Rosa Maria Tarraco and Thomas Streins from the European University Institute, who also contributed legal research. From Fraunhofer ISI, we had Karsten Schwabe, Andreas Humler, and Knut Lind. And then Astor also contributed on the OFE side, and we had Felix contributing from the GitHub side. Felix also helped author the original feasibility study for the German Sovereign Tech Fund, so that was very crucial support. So here's the initial situation. This will not be news to most of the people in this room, but most of the software that we all depend on is reliant on open source software components. So we sometimes bias in the way we talk towards end user applications and services, but there's huge dependencies in terms of the use of open source software all the way down the stack. And so estimates range in terms of their prevalence and in terms of the contribution to GDP. But we can reliably say that more than 70% of all modern software is dependent on open source software, and it's really the invisible backbone of digital innovation. Despite this, we find that many of the foundational libraries lack continued stable funding and professional maintenance, creating systemic risks when you consider how that technology is being used at scale, and also what our obligations are as a society in terms of contributing back to it, in terms of public interest. So we're extending what the German Sovereign Tech Fund has already pioneered and saying we should treat this software as open digital infrastructure, and then we should understand specifically what some of the market and system failures are at the EU level that lead us to advocate for EU-wide funding, and what that funding could reasonably be directed towards when you differentiate it from a national level fund, for example. So I'll talk a little bit around what we're suggesting in the study in terms of our solution approach. So we're imagining the EU Sovereign Tech Fund as a scaled up pan-European, so that means a collaboration of all 27 EU member states, and mission-driven evolution of Germany's sovereign tech fund to invest in the maintenance, security, and improvement of strategically important open source software globally. So as compared to the German sovereign tech fund, we tried to position this a little bit more in terms of some of the policy discourses that are ongoing in the European Union right now, specifically around digital sovereignty, which is having even more of a moment than it was 5 years ago, and competitiveness. In terms of digital sovereignty, what we're really arguing for is not digital sovereignty as an end in and of itself. You will see this being advocated quite widely across the ecosystem by a number of different actors, whether it's the Eurostack initiative in terms of civil society and industry, or policymakers in terms of the European Parliament. But what we're talking about when we talk about sovereignty is kind of the underpinnings of sovereignty. So open source software is an enabler of autonomy and of resilience. So the ability to make choices, but also the capacity to actually implement those choices. And then also resilience, which is kind of the ability to withstand shocks and to respond to critical failures or security incidents. In terms of cybersecurity, what we're really talking about is trying to understand what the role of this software is in terms of the security landscape and map vulnerabilities, and then channel funding towards areas where that funding could be most productive in terms of mitigating the potential consequences were that software to fail or were those vulnerabilities to be exploited. And then finally, in terms of competitiveness, we argue that there are huge economic benefits from open source software investment, and that by diversifying the funding landscape, we can show that government-driven funding can have a unique forcing role in terms of being able to invest in some of the software communities that might go underrepresented in the broader funding landscape, so to speak. One of our main contributions as part of this study was really to create these design criteria and to think about what the obligations were on the community that supports the European Union to implement this fund in terms of holding it to task and making sure that that fund is scaled responsibly to the EU level. One of the main concerns that we've heard throughout the production of this research, but also subsequently as we've started talking about it at conferences like this, is the idea that there is a high potential for political capture, and that such a fund could, quite easily become a tool or an instrument of political power, or simply just be subject to kind of stagnation or inertia. So what we're trying to say is that while that is a possibility, by kind of adhering to these design criteria, we think that there's a higher possibility of making sure that the fund is successful, and that if it's implemented as part of one of these political processes that we'll talk about in a moment, it's done so responsibly and with the interests of the community in mind. So first and foremost, we talk around the need for pooled financing and coordination. So even beyond what the German Sovereign Tech Fund does, we believe that there's a unique role for such an EU Sovereign Tech Fund in pooling funding from different actors, including not just the European Union, but also member states and industry. And that there is a kind of forcing role that that can have in terms of being able to catalyze investment, but also align on where that funding actually goes, and to what extent it's actually kind of productively funneled towards. We also highlight the need for low bureaucracy. So basically reducing kind of the application and reporting requirements on this open source software developers as they apply to secure this funding. There's a need for political independence, so kind of trying to structure the fund in such a way as to insulate it from some of the political pressures and enable some continuity, similar to what the German Sovereign Tech Fund has been able to achieve. We also talk about flexibility. Flexibility can be defined in terms of the types of funding, so whether it's a grant or more kind of recurring funding, or it can be also in terms of how the funding actually gets out the door and the ability to update that funding recurrence over time. It also needs to be developer friendly, so this means kind of designed with the interests and understanding of open source software communities and open collaboration in mind. So there needs to be a strong community focus as a result. That kind of corresponds to that developer friendliness. Of course, there needs to be strategic alignment with EU goals, and we've already talked about what some of those high priority goals are, but there are a number of other policy goals that are also important. And then this fund needs to be transparent. One of the central critiques of many EU-wide funding instruments is that they're not very clear. They can be very opaque in terms of what they're trying to do. And there can also be kind of a scope creep or kind of an inertia that kicks in over time. So we want to make sure that this fund resists some of those pressures and that it's very much being designed with the interests of the community in mind. I'll talk around this 350 million number, and I'll give it a bunch of caveats. So basically what we did for our study was we tried to determine the minimum possible level of investment that we could reasonably ask for from the EU, and then try and communicate that as a starting point. So what we came up with was a number of 350 million, and that would be invested over a 7-year period. So for those that are unfamiliar, the way the EU budget is structured is that it's negotiated through these multi-annual financial framework negotiations, and it's negotiated for a 7-year period. So right now, they're in the process of trying to secure a budget for 2028 to 2034, and that process started earlier this summer and will continue into next year. So as part of that kind of 7-year cycle, what we're advocating for is that the EU should invest a minimum, and again, this is a minimum, of 350 million euros into the open source software ecosystem. How did we get to that number? Well, we took what Germany was already doing and we scaled it up to the population of the EU level, and then we multiplied that by 7. Again, this is a lower bound, but we think it's a useful starting point, and it's not mutually exclusive of industry and member states contributing in as well. So we hope that if you consider all of those other factors, that within the next few years we could try and mobilize as much as €1 billion in investment for open source software, which is certainly not enough, but it's certainly a starting point. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jen, and Jen's going to talk a little bit more around kind of some of the legal analysis that the team at the European University Institute did, and then 2 active kind of budgetary scenarios we considered for how to implement this fund.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Nick. And before I start, my gratitude to my co-authors, but most particularly Nick, because he really drove the charge with this and kept corralling us cats into making the report come to fruition. So with the report, we considered 2 different legal institutional avenues. Firstly, the moonshot of the report was to have a standalone and centralised fund, a new funding body created by legislation and set aside during the MFF negotiations. A strong advantage of such a centralised model lies in its coherence and the strong political signal that it sends. However, on the flip side, starting afresh, starting with no infrastructure in place, would be very time intensive and would partly depend on getting and maintaining the political will to invest in something like this. The second option was to have a hybrid shared management structure, leveraging existing EU institutional frameworks such as an edict that allows for pooled contributions of member states alongside EU and even industry co-financing. And within that, we considered 3 different possible avenues: joint undertakings, important projects of common European interest, and European Digital Infrastructure Consortia, EDIC. We also caveat in our report that out of these 2 options, neither is necessarily mutually exclusive. No single path offers the most viable option, and each has its own strengths and weaknesses. Ultimately, the hybrid shared management structure offers distinct advantages when it comes to flexibility and preservation of the character of the EU Sovereign Tech Fund scaled up to the European level, and it would not require legislation or similar legislative amendment, as would be the case of the standalone fund. So here I'm going to talk a little bit more about the model that we ultimately advocate for adoption, which is the edict. We came to the conclusion that this is expedient, highly pragmatic, politically viable alternative, balancing EU-level direction with flexible implementation and co-investment. Edicts are a significant new implementation mechanism for member states to collectively develop and operate digital infrastructures. They were inspired by the European Research Infrastructure Consortia, ERICS, but differ in terms of their primary focus, namely in favouring deployment in industry as ERICS focus on research. And the main purpose of an edict is to provide a legal framework to invest in multi-state collective projects that member states cannot set up individually given their scale. And given the scale and ambition of this, we thought that that was the most appropriate mechanism. There are a number of thresholds that need to be met in order to establish an edict. I won't go into details, the report is there for that. But at a base level, there needs to be at least 3 EU member states that apply and receive permission from the European Commission. They must have a statutory seat in a participating member state, and all member states must recognise its distinct legal personality. The particular strengths of the edict model were in its ability to have diverse contributions. This could be from industry, from states, from civil society, and the nature of an edict is that there is a statute, like the implementing rules that are created in seeking approval from the European Commission, but the substance of those rules is entirely up to the founding members. So for instance, they could say, we want to have a flexible funding structure, or we want to have votes from a variety of stakeholders, not necessarily just states. And picking up on an important point that Nick made about digital sovereignty and how this ties into the EU-STF, but also the German STF model, we both advocate for a vision of digital sovereignty which recognises that open source is something that we collectively depend on and benefit from, but the contributions into open source aren't necessarily constrained within national borders. For instance, the German STF, STA, they support projects where the developers aren't necessarily based in Germany, and a similar model would be advocated for here. So because of those reasons of diversity, flexibility, and ultimately this is an existing and recently established mechanism that the EU has for such projects, we ultimately suggest that the edict is the path forward. Nick.
Why are we talking about this here today? Basically, what we think is really important is that governments start investing in open source software. We don't think that there are unique advantages of public funding necessarily, but that the public is very well supported to invest in such an ecosystem. So if you draw on the literature of commons and common pool resources and public goods, what you really see is government stepping up to invest in things like roads and bridges, or kind of public services that are really kind of the foundational parts of our societies. And we think that it's time to start thinking about open digital infrastructure, as we call it, as such a responsibility. And so what we really want to show is that the EU is not necessarily unique, but that given what Germany has already done, it's really well positioned to kind of start marshalling these resources and start investing them into the ecosystem, particularly given some of the political challenges that the European Union is facing in 2025. So as part of our call to action, we're really calling on the European Commission as part of its ongoing MFF negotiations to decide between one of these two models and earmark a minimum of 350 million euros for support for open source software, and specifically open source software that's beneath the applications and services layer. We want the EU to earmark that funding as soon and expediently as possible, and we're not too picky. We would love for this funding to be invested by a centralized fund, but we would also be very happy for this funding to be invested by an EDIC, for example. And then finally, it'll be the work on all of us, so people in this room that are part of the open source software ecosystem, to help operationalize the fund, to procure maintenance, to procure developer resources, to procure time and attention on the software and services that we all depend on. And so, fragmented or episodic funding is not going to be sufficient, and we believe that government funding can play a really unique role here. So I won't go through all of our kind of high-level recommendations, but feel free to check out our report and go through some of the more detailed recommendations around how we can actually make this fund possible. What I hope you take away from our talk here today is really just that I think there's a better chance than ever to make this funding possible in the EU, and I hope that other regions across the globe will start to follow if the EU does indeed step up. Just a quick note, which is that since we published this study in July, we've had multiple conversations which suggest that there is a possibility that DG Connect, which is one of the main digital directorates in the EU, will actually make a recommendation for some version of open source funding. And we're optimistic that something will happen in the coming months, but we're kind of in a holding pattern while we wait and see in terms of what the EU decides to actually do. At the same time, we're going to continue having conversations with some of the other edicts, hopefully the Digital Commons Edict, which is in the process of hiring an executive director and is kind of similar in some ways to what we're advocating for with our EDIC approach, but is much more focused on kind of commons-based use cases and innovation and kind of the scale-up of some of those use cases. So we'll continue those conversations in the coming months. We'll know more around what the EU budget actually looks like next year. And in the meantime, we hope that some version of what we're proposing in the study can become a reality. And if not, we can use it as kind of a benchmark to hold people's feet to the fire and say that this is the right thing to do. So thank you so much. And if you have any questions, we'd be happy to answer them.
And to quote Nick's rule back to himself, one question.